y'all, Dixie here. The colder months are upon us, so today I want to talk to you about storing your gear properly for the season and making sure you do it in a way that it's gonna last you for years to come. Our backpacking gear sees a lot of dirt, sweat, and grime throughout the backpacking season. So the best practice for making sure that any of your gear stays in good condition for years to come, because it's not a cheap investment, is to make sure that you clean it properly before you store it. So for my pack, the way that I have found is easiest to wash it is to put it in something like a little cheap kiddie pool, or maybe a big Rubbermaid bin that's big enough to hold it, or even your bathtub. But I found outside versus inside makes less of a mess. But then you just fill it up with some warm water or even cool water and some sort of gear wash, preferably like Granger's or Nick Wax. If you don't have that, then just a gentle soap, and then just swish it around. You could use something like a soft toothbrush. You know, I would go with a used one, not the one that you currently use, to scrub any problem areas or especially gross areas. But my hesitation with scrubbing too much on your pack is, especially if you have some sort of waterproofing treatment, you don't want to scrub on that too much. Then just air dry your pack in the sun and make sure that it's completely dry before you store it. Moving on to your shelter, whether you use a tent, a hammock, a tarp, a bivvy, or a combination, those things should also be washed well to get out any of the hiker funk. I mean, you know how it is when you've used it for several months or several trips, and then you get into it and it smells kind of rank. It's good to get that out before the next season, because there's no sense in leaving that bacteria in there to continue to multiply. For trip-to-trip use, I would especially make sure it's completely dried before you pack it up. Sometimes maybe your last day on trail is rainy and you throw it in the stuff sack and then get home with it. Make sure you set it out to dry before putting it away to the next trip. But especially at the end of the hiking season, a good cleaning on that shelter is a great idea. So for this one, depending on what you have, hammock, tarp, etc., it's always best to go by the manufacturer's instructions as far as how to properly clean it in a safe way so that you don't damage any waterproofing. But for a general rule of thumb, something like a tent or a tarp, you can use the gear wash that I was mentioning before, like Granger's or Nick Wax, and just be careful with it. But doing it like your pack, submerging it, or even just getting out in the yard with a hose pipe and rubbing it down with a soft sponge, nothing that's going to create any real abrasion. But getting the sediment off will be a good thing. And once again, just make sure you completely air dry it before you put it up. For tents and tarps or anything of that nature, bivvies, before you store them at the end of the season, it's a good time to look at the seams very well and make sure that there aren't any seams that need sealed if your shelter is seam sealed or seam taped. Because with wear and tear of the season, there can be areas that need a little extra TLC before you take them out again next spring. For storing your tents, it's probably best not to stuff them away and instead to hang them up across a hanger in a closet. But if you must stuff them away, then for Dyneema, from what I seem to have landed on finally, they say that the best thing to do is to fold it, roll it, and then put it in the stuff sack. I've been known to just stuff all of my shelters, but I have been corrected. So for nylon tents or tents made out of other materials, stuffing is what you want to do, so you're not continuing to fold and roll the tent the same way and therefore crease it and wear it out on that same line over and over. But when in doubt, again, contact the company that created your shelter, and they should be able to give you the best practice for either stuffing or folding and rolling. Sleeping bags and or quilts should be washed in a front-loading washer or in a washer that does not have an agitator, unless otherwise instructed by the manufacturer. There are some that say you should hand wash, and so you would do this in like a bathtub, or again, the kiddie pool could come in handy. For down, there are down specific detergents, if you will. You don't want to use just a regular laundry detergent because it can strip the down of its oils and cause it to not be so poofy and fluffy and insulating to you. For synthetic bags, you can use, again, a Granger's or a Nick Wax, and that should be fine. Be careful when you put your sleeping bag in the dryer, because even if you have it on a low heat setting, it could be too hot for the shell of the sleeping bag and end up melting, and you come back to a dryer full of a bunch of down or synthetic fluff. If you don't have a front-loading washer or dryer, then hit up the nearby laundromat. But again, double check multiple times as you're drying to make sure that it's not getting too hot. If the idea of putting your expensive quilt or sleeping bag in the dryer makes you nervous, I don't blame you. You can actually lay flat to dry and even blow a fan on the sleeping bag as it's drying. And then you'll notice that the loft will start lofting up, but during that process, ever so often go by and separate the down and just keep doing that until it's reached its full loftiness again. It might take a little while, but it'll get there. And with everything else, of course, make sure it's 100% dry before you store it away. And when storing a sleeping bag or a quilt, you 100% with this item do not want to store it squished down in a stuff sack or a compression sack. Instead, I would recommend getting a cotton cloth laundry bag, just one of those really big bags, and then place it in there where it can still be fluffed up to its max. And then I like to put that on a hanger and hang it up in the closet. Sleeping pad. If you have an inflatable sleeping pad, at the end of the season is a good time to check for any pinholes, any leaks. So if you inflate it and then submerge it, again, whether in a bathtub or kiddie pool, you will see any little bubbles coming out from the sleeping pad if there's a leak where the air is coming out and pushing the water. They sell patch kits online that are pretty easy to use. I always carry one with me on trail, and I have repaired mine in the field before. But anyway, that's something that you want to make sure you take care of before your next trip in the spring, so you don't end up with a flat pad sleeping directly on the ground. But while you have it submerged, you might as well go ahead and take some of that gear wash and lightly scrub it down to remove any oils, bacteria, dirt, and funk from your body that has been transferred onto the pad. With an inflatable pad, when you store it, it's good to do so with the valve open, because with moisture closed inside that space, it can breed bacteria and you'll end up with a moldy inner sleeping pad. That's pretty gross. So if you just open that valve up and then hang it on a hanger in the closet, it'll be good to go until the spring. With a closed cell phone pad, obviously you don't have to worry about the things you do with an inflatable one, but it's still a good idea once a year to give it a good scrub down. Next up is clothing. At the end of the season is a good time to go through all of your hiking clothes and decide, is this something that I actually still use? Do I really love it? Is it comfortable? And if you end up separating some things to the side that you decide you haven't used that hiking season, well, if they're in usable condition, maybe you can donate them. Also, check all of your clothing and make sure that it's in usable condition for you for the next year. Do you have anything that's super holey and needs replacing? Do you have some darn tough socks that maybe it's time to cash in on that lifetime warranty? But making sure all of those things are handled so you don't find out your first trip of the spring like, oh my God, I don't have all of the things I need. I thought I was covered. This will keep you from being in that situation. Puffy coats should be cleaned just like I mentioned with the sleeping bags. If you've got a down puffy coat, then you'll want to use the specific down wash. If not, then like the Nick Wax Tech Wash would be good for a synthetic puffy. And you can store them hanging up on a hanger in your closet, or I guess if you wanted to, you could just put it in the same cotton sack that you've got your sleeping bag or quilt in. As long as, again, everything has enough room to loft fully and naturally. Footwear. Shoes and boots can always use a little scrubbing down too. For my trail runners, I like to remove the insoles, remove the laces, and put them all in the washer together on a gentle cycle. That works for me, and then I air dry them out in the sun. I probably wouldn't put a pair of hiking boots in there, not that you couldn't, but I just wouldn't want to do that to my washer machine. So you could take those outside, hose them down, scrub them up a little bit. The idea is to remove as much bacteria and sediment as you can so they'll be fresh for the next hiking season. Rain gear. Your raincoat, rain pants, rain skirt, whatever you have, can be washed with Nick Wax TX Direct. And this is a product that will actually kind of give a little reboost to the DWR coating or waterproof coating on your rain gear. And that's always a good idea to kind of boost that from season to season, because eventually that stuff can wear down. It will give you instructions on how to do this in your washer machine, so you can check that out for all of the details. But I've done this in the past and will continue to do it going forward. Black with tents, I recommend before you put your rain gear away, check all of the seams and make sure that it doesn't need a refresh on either seam sealing or seam taping, depending on what your garment has. I like to hang my rain gear on a hanger in the closet. I also like to hike with an umbrella, so I like to give my umbrella a good looking down and make sure there aren't any pinholes that need patched with gear tape. And if I've got any little spokes on my umbrella, I just toss it and go on and get a new one. And for the portable kitchen, wash and dry any of your pots, cups, spoons, etc., and make sure that stuff's good and clean. I typically hand wash my stuff between hikes, but for the end of the year, giving it a good run through a dishwasher, I feel like cleans it better. Even my food bag, I don't put it in the dishwasher, but I put it in the sink, make sure it's rinsed out with some soap and water, and then completely air dried before I put it away. Fuel should be stored in a climate controlled area if possible. You don't want it in extreme temperatures, anything too hot or too cold. And for water filters, I just buy a new Sawyer Squeeze each season, but if you don't want to do that and you just want to use it until failure, then most filters, or at least the Sawyer Squeezes, come with a back flushing syringe. So you just put clean water and then go against the way that you would normally filter it as far as flow goes. Remember that tapping the filter on a hard surface, not something that's going to bust it, but just kind of help dislodge any of the sediment, is good practice to get it good and cleaned out. And then you just keep back flushing until it runs clear. If you don't have a syringe, a smart water bottle with the sports cap will fit on the end of the Sawyer Squeeze to back flush it. This is something that you should do not just at the end of the season, but between every single trip to make sure that you continue getting a good flow rate. And then completely air dry before you store it. Water bladders, fill up completely with warm water and then put some bleach in it, maybe 5 drops per liter. Let it sit for 30 minutes, empty it out, maybe rinse it again to get the bleach out, and completely air dry. Electronics. Make sure all of the batteries that are removable from any of your electronics are taken out and stored separately from the item. That way you don't end up with any corrosion issues, ruining electrical components inside your electrical device. For anything that has a rechargeable battery, from everything that I can tell, and directly from Anchor, who makes these backup battery banks, they say to fully charge it before long-term storage. 1, that's supposed to help your battery last longer, but 2, that'll save you time when you go for your next trip, and even though it probably won't still be at 100%, you won't have to charge quite as much as if it was starting at 0. And then anything that would be safe to do so, you can wipe down with a damp cloth, especially my headlamp. That band I know gets a lot of sweat and grease on it, so I like to wash it down as well as I can. Food. Nothing is worse than going on a trip in the spring, starting to pack your food bag and realizing all of that stuff you had stored up is expired and you need to go to the grocery store last minute. So as you're packing away all your gear, it doesn't hurt to go through your backpacking meals, your tuna packets, etc., and making sure all of that stuff is still in date and is going to still be good by the time your next trip comes up. And last but not least, first aid kit. I don't carry a super extensive first aid kit. Mine is pretty minimal, but I still want to make sure that it's completely restocked before I set it aside until the spring. And then looking at the specific items like ibuprofen, Imodium, Neosporin, and making sure those things are not going to be expired by the time the spring rolls around is important. And then even things like adhesives or gauze, making sure that the unused packages that I still have in my first aid kit are not torn open and, compromised in some way. Well, all right, y'all, that is all I have for you on ways to clean up your gear and properly store it away until the next hiking season. If you have any recommendations on this that I did not mention, maybe tips and tricks that you found work for you, please feel free to share that in the comments below, as we are all always learning here. And soon I want to get into gear organization. That's something that I am working on personally because I have been terrible at it in the past. So I will let y'all know what I come up with on that. Thank y'all so much for watching, and we will see y'all next time.